Thanks everyone for joining the webinar today. We're going to be going through what paper is best for me with a wide variety of papers in the Moab line. Evan is going to go through the differences between the papers, finishes, and materials, characteristics of each, and how the paper influences perception of the print. We'll answer all of your questions at the end of the webinar. We have Jim Graham also with us to help answer some of these questions because, you know, Evan and Jim have two very different perspectives on this, so it'll be great to kind of go through both. So I'm going to toss it over to Evan to start his presentation.
Thanks everybody for joining us. So today we're going to start out with kind of an overview of paper characteristics, what it's made of, and why that matters. And then we'll look at specific papers, compare, contrast, kind of give you some guides on how to start out, how to use them for your images, and then obviously answer your questions throughout. So without further ado, share my screen. So the first thing that we talk about a lot is kind of what the paper is made of. So most papers are made from either cotton or wood pulp, which we call alpha cellulose. And then there are the other materials that are more kind of specialty papers that we see a lot more of now. So you'll hear some terms thrown around a lot. Rag papers are mostly or all cotton. Some people also call these fine art papers because cotton has been a component of paper for a very long time, and a lot of your high quality drawing, pastel, lithography, art papers are all made of cotton, so they're often called fine art. Alpha cellulose papers, again, are tree papers. They're 100% wood pulp. And then sometimes those two materials get blended in a paper base for a number of reasons, whether that's cost, texture, thickness, how dense of a sheet you need, all that sort of thing. And then on top of those, there's a lot of other things. Washi paper, traditional Japanese paper, which is generally made of mulberry or kozo fiber, canvas, and then there's bamboo, hemp, sugarcane, all sorts of other things. And then your specialty papers like a metallic or a high gloss or something else like that. So that kind of helps us divide paper into categories. Matte papers are alpha cellulose, generally smooth finish. Rag papers, again, or fine art papers, are made out of cotton. Your RC papers, which were resin coated back in the day, now we call those, you know, glossy luster, satin, semi-gloss, that sort of thing. Baryta papers, which can either have cellulose or cotton base, just means that they have a barium sulfate coating, which gives you a slightly whiter sheet and that kind of satin gloss surface finish without any optical brighteners. Again, your washi papers, traditionally Japanese papers, and then your specialty papers. So one thing that gets asked a lot is, hey, what's that number next to the sheet? So for instance, on the Juniper Baryta, it says Juniper Baryta Rag 305. Well, that number is not a measure of thickness. It's actually GSM, or grams per square meter. So what does 1 square meter of that specific paper weigh? And when you're comparing a cotton paper to a cotton paper, then yes, you can kind of judge that a 190 is going to be thinner than a 300. But if you're comparing different substrates, so if you compare the juniper, which is the cotton paper, to the luster, which is a cellulose paper, they're both 300 gram papers, but the luster is half the thickness of the juniper. So just keep in mind that GSM is a measure of mass, not a measure of thickness. Thickness or caliper will be listed in the paper specification. So if you're looking for something with a specific thickness, don't look at the GSM number, look at the caliper. Another, I think, common misconception is ink absorbency. So all inkjet papers, glossy, satin, matte, fine art, they all have a receiver layer applied to the surface of the paper, and that's what holds the inks. So the ink is not actually absorbed into the base sheet. So matte papers do not use significantly more ink because they're absorbent, because that ink is trapped in that, what's captured in that receiver layer. That's also what lends to the archivalness of a paper. So matte black papers, you know, at most use 5% plus or minus ink versus photo black papers. So you're not going to worry that if you start putting on matte paper, your ink budget's going to go way up. That doesn't happen. Another source of confusion can be, what do we call these papers? Well, we kind of divide them up by a matte surface paper, something without a shine, uses, if you're printing with pigment ink, matte black ink, and a surface that's shiny uses photo black ink. So we try to call them matte black papers and photo black papers, and that makes it much easier to kind of comprehend what we're talking about. And we don't say coated or uncoated or that sort of thing, because they're all coated, as we just discussed, for the ink absorbency. So I'm going to call them matte black for matte papers and photo black for anything that has a shine or a gloss to it. We'll dig a little more into that. Matte black versus photo black. Why do they look different? So photo black papers, because of that surface shine, reflect more light, and they reflect it right back to us as the viewer. And because of that, blacks look a little darker, images look a little more saturated, and it looks like you have a slightly larger tonal range. Whereas matte black papers, they kind of scatter that light reflection. So blacks look a little bit lighter and colors look a little less saturated. And again, this isn't a downside of a matte black paper, it's just a different look. And as we explore papers, you'll use that look to your advantage. So based on that, the question is, what papers fit your subject matter, your personal preference, and what you had in your head when you snapped the shutter and took that image? We want to translate that to the viewer using a paper choice. Another thing that's a factor of papers is optical brighteners. So both cotton and cellulose are not white in their natural states. So we have to whiten them up when we make paper. And a lot of your cotton rags and that sort of thing use components in the paper process or in the coating to create it at a whiter shade without using optical brighteners. But our bright white papers use optical brighteners. And what those are, is that's a component similar to what's in laundry soap that makes your shirt glow under a black light. But it's a substance that absorbs ultraviolet light and then fluoresces it back as visible blue light, which we see as making the paper whiter. And some people are concerned about, yes, optical brighteners do have a finite lifespan, kind of based on how much UV they receive over the life of it. And as the optical brighteners kind of wear out over a long period of time, nothing changes. The inks don't change, the paper doesn't change, it doesn't degrade the print or anything. The base sheet of paper is just a little less white if you were to compare it to a fresh sheet of the same age. Now, if you're framing your prints under archival or UV glass, or you're coating them with a UV protectant spray, you're going to limit or completely eliminate the amount of UV that reaches the paper, therefore negating the optical brighteners in the first place. So it's not a use it or don't use it. It's just something to be aware of as you're thinking about what paper you want to use, what you're going to do with it, all those sorts of things. And another thing to touch on really quick here is third-party inks, or inks that were not made by your printer manufacturer. It's easy to see them as they are cheaper when you buy them, but third-party inks come with a lot of challenges. The first being the archivability is completely up in the air. Inks that you get from Canon or Epson or HP, those are made to a certain standard, and they're chemically identical 2 years ago to what will be made 2 years from now. And you're paying effectively for that quality when you buy the ink. Third-party inks, you don't know who made it, you don't know if it was tested, you don't know if the color is consistent batch to batch, and it's not formulated to work with the head in your printer, so you're likely to have more cleaning cycles, which uses more ink and potentially clog your print head. So you've invested all this time and money in all of your equipment. We absolutely recommend using the OEM inks made by your printer manufacturer, because they're going to give you the most consistent results. And then the last thing is, as you're looking at your prints and evaluating papers, you want to make sure you're doing so under a good quality light source, because we can only see the color in the print if that wavelength is present in the light. So one good tool that is been recently released is from Calibrite, and that's their Grafilite. It's a color accurate little desktop light, retails for about $120. That's really useful for looking at prints. If you don't want to take that step, make sure if you're using just a regular halogen light bulb, that's full spectrum, but it's going to be a little warmer because it's a yellower light. Otherwise, a good LED bulb with a CRI, or a color rendering index of 90 to 95, is going to be almost full spectrum. Try to avoid fluorescent bulbs compact fluorescent bulbs or cheap LED bulbs, because again, you're not going to get an accurate look at what's actually in your print. And this kind of gives a sense of what I'm talking about. So the bottom bar is an 80 CRI bulb, and you can see it's missing reds, it's missing blues. So again, if your print has those colors in it under that light source, you won't see them at all. And then the last thing is you take a few sheets out of the box, you set them down somewhere, you come back a little later and you think, oh no, I don't know what side's the print side. Well, the quickest and easiest way is to take a Post-it sticky note, adhere it just to the edge of the paper, and it will stick like Velcro to the print side, and it will barely stick to the not print side. And just make sure that you don't stick that Post-it note in the middle of the sheet, because it does risk leaving a little ghost in the paper coating. So just do it at the edge. If it sticks, that's your print side. And we do label on the bag inside every box as to what the print side is of the paper. So that just is necessary. If you take a sheet out, you set it down, you're not sure. All right, and to quickly wrap up the formal part of this, what affects print longevity? So the type of paper, as we discussed, it needs to be archival, acid-free. If it's cellulose, it needs to be lignin-free. All of the Moab papers are archival. The type of ink you use for the print, pigment ink will outlast dye ink. Exposure to UV and humidity, those are the two killers of great art, no matter what it's made on. Any sort of paper is sensitive to UV and humidity. We recommend, especially if you're doing archival prints or gallery prints, handle your paper with cotton gloves from when it comes out of the box to when you're handling it after it's printed. That just prevents transferring anything from your skin onto that paper. Make sure you're using neutral pH, museum grade archival framing materials, anything that comes in contact with that print. A lot of inexpensive frames will come with a piece of cardboard as the backer. Well, if you put that cardboard right in contact with the paper, it's going to leach the acid and other chemicals that are in the cardboard right into your photo paper and start to yellow it, sometimes fairly quickly. So make sure you take that piece of cardboard, toss it, replace it with a nice archival, maybe rising museum board backer piece. And then again, when it comes to storing prints, your prints like the same environment that you do. Not too hot, not too cold, not too humid, not too dry. Don't put your prints in the attic or out in the garage or whatever else. Store them in a temperature controlled area that is part of where you live. So now we'll get into how to put this information to use. How do you choose what paper to start with? Well, you're going to choose photo black or matte black. You're going to determine tooth and surface texture. Do you want a smooth paper? Do you want a little bit of texture? Do you want a lot of texture? Does it matter to you that the paper has optical brighteners in it? What's the detail? What's the base tone of the paper? How much saturation do you need? What does it cost? If you're just starting out and you're going to do some experimenting and make a lot of prints, you don't need to invest in a heavyweight cotton paper, because a cellulose paper like the LaSalle Photo Matte is going to be much more affordable if you're just running through and starting to do the process. What will you do with the print? What's your preference? And how does the paper affect the image? This is kind of the biggest concept that we'll talk about here, is you can guide your viewer to a certain idea about the paper or about the print just by what paper you put it on. And when somebody walks up to look at your print, they're not going to be thinking about what paper you used and why you used the paper and all that sort of thing. They're just going to see the print be drawn in, and your paper choice will guide them on a perceptive journey that you want to send them on. And to best understand this, test the papers, make prints. We have a sample box. It's 2 sheets of everything. So my best advice is buy the sample box, download all the profiles, get the media settings, pick an image or 2 that is most representative of what you love to shoot, how you edit, the work you want to do, all that sort of thing. Print that image or those 2 images on every sheet of paper and then lay them out in front of you. And you'll be astonished at how the paper changes the look of the image. Papers that'll surprise you, papers that you thought you knew really well that look different from maybe what you experienced 10 years ago or 20 years ago in the darkroom or at the little mini lab down the street. And then from that batch of papers, you're going to pick 2 or 3 that are going to be kind of your go-tos, and you're going to get to know those really well. But then in 6 months or a year, you'll take out all those prints again, because maybe you'll have a new project, or you've switched to portraits from landscapes or whatever else, and you can put all those prints back out, and based on what you're looking for, pick a new paper, but it's all your images. All the papers are labeled, and you'll have a really great tool to kind of determine where you're going and how you want to get there. Let's kind of switch over and jump into looking at papers and get a sense of putting all this into practice. And Paige, anybody send in a question yet?
Yes, so we have a bunch of questions. How do optical brighteners impact a printed image lifespan?
So again, it doesn't really affect the lifespan of the printed image. It just means that if you have a paper with optical brighteners and you hang it in an environment where it gets a decent amount of UV light over a long period of time, years or decades, you'll start to wear out those brighteners so they won't fluoresce anymore. But again, paper is going to look the same, print's going to look the same. There's no degradation to the print. The base white of the paper just becomes a little bit warmer. So you could, if you want to think about what would happen if you truly, had your optical brighteners wear out, you could just look at, say, the Intrada Rag Natural versus the Intrada Rag Bright to see what the difference would be. And again, because we're indoors here and there's no UV present in the light, if you look at these two papers, even to me here, they look almost identical. The natural is just a little whiter than the bright. But if 30, 40 years from now, your optical brighteners were worn out in the Rag Bright, all that would happen is that it would turn to look like the Rag Natural. So there's no degradation of the print, kind of.
Evan, do you find that when you are printing with the brightener or a paper using those brighteners, that you have to adjust your file just a bit to overcome a little bit of a bluish cast?
The easy answer is no, but I
Okay.
also wasn't looking for it. So
Okay.
I think that would be probably more common if you were doing kind of a black and white. You might get a little bluer look,
A little bluer look.
a little cooler print if you have OBAs in the paper. And again, that's because they're not whiteners. They absorb UV and fluoresce it back as blue light. So it actually does shift your white point a little bit blue, and it also makes it appear brighter.
Someone is asking for recommended paper types to consider for black and white images.
And that's a good place to start here. So for a black and white, not to be unhelpful, but you can really print it on anything. But my go-to recommendations for black and white are the Juniper Baryta, which is a sort of a satin surface, and then also either the Intrada Brighter Natural, and then if you want a little texture, the Intrada Cold Press is a fantastic paper. So here's a good little comparison right here, as we were talking about matte black versus photo black. So the Intrada Rag Natural Cold Press is a textured matte cotton paper. And you can see we still get really nice colors. We get really good detail in the black and whites. And, there's no surface reflection at all. The Juniper, again, it's going to look probably just a little richer. That can be, hard to show over the internet, but you just get a little richer look on the Juniper. And again, you can see that it does have that satin surface. So these two would be excellent for black and whites. If you don't want a texture, you could just do the regular Intrada Natural. But again, it's going to be, what's the look of your paper? What's the look of the image that you want to achieve? Is it a landscape where you want kind of some depth and some subtlety, which is where you might consider the cotton matte? Is it something that you want to be more sort of photorealistic? That's going to be the Juniper, because it's going to be more like you're there in Technicolor, right? It has that traditional photo look to it. And that's where printing the images yourself on the sample box is going to give you a good source of where you're going with that. Another comparison would be, I think, Jim, this is actually your image of the lion.
Yep.
But this is a little different, because what we have here is we have the opposite end of the spectrum. We have the slick rock metallic pearl. So almost a three-dimensional look, fairly high gloss, but that metallic layer really defines your edges and gives it some depth. And then we contrast that with the other side of the spectrum, which is the Moenkopi Kozo. So it's a kind of a velvet finish, traditional Japanese paper. And again, it's holding the detail extremely well, but you can see shine, no shine. And so whereas the pearl is in this image, I think more analogous to seeing it perhaps on your computer monitor, the Kozo to me is the lion in real life. It's velvet. It really kind of accentuates the fur and the look of the animal. So for these two, I love them both, but I would go with the Kozo to me because it's the most lifelike and realistic. But again, what did you see in your head when you made that image? That's what's going to guide you on the paper.
It's all what you really want to feel or want your viewer to feel when you make that print. You know, with the Kozo, you know, you can add a little bit of extra sharpening in to get that feel, but with the other, you're going to find that you're going to see every little tiny bit of detail. So if you over sharpen or you over enlarge, you're going to see it, and it's not going to be necessarily as forgiving because it does render every bit of your file with the
And
slick.
that's another tool, is an image that suffers from some degradation in quality, whether, you know, maybe it was a phone photo in low light, so it's kind of noisy, or, you know, it was an in-camera JPEG that was over sharpened or whatever else. You can kind of hide and balance some of those flaws by printing on a matte paper, because your viewer is going to see kind of the surface of the paper in the image a little more, just like you were saying, because something like on the pearl, it's going to be very exact, and you're going to see all those pixels that you might otherwise not want to see.
You can by adding a layer of grain, by simply just saying, you know, add a layer, fill it with overlay, and make sure that that's neutral gray, and then add Gaussian noise to it. You can hide a lot of sins. And the nice thing is that layer won't be seen on your paper, but
Right.
you'll have a little bit of grain that'll make your image look a little bit more like a classic film photograph. And then choosing juniper, especially if you're using black and white, some people from a distance won't be able to tell if you're using silver chloride paper that has the same feel as the juniper, or if you're using a digital paper. It's really interesting.
And this is a good segue into this question. Could you please speak a bit on the virtues and pitfalls of Japanese and specialty papers, and what kind of images work well with them?
I think
Go ahead, Evan. I'm sorry.
That's all right. I think the biggest thing to think about when you're using the Japanese papers and specialty papers is they will have typically a slightly smaller gamut and a little warmer white point than a traditional photo paper. So again, if you're trying to do this flawless reproduction of the lion, or, you know, a high fashion portrait or something, that's probably not gonna best complement the look of the paper. But with that in mind, then you can use them as more of a creative tool. So for instance, the Unryu, again, a little tougher to see here, but I can backlight it. It has long fibers to it. So when you make a print on the Unryu, you get these really nice long paper fibers that for instance, the lion image, those work really well. But it's not typically a great portrait paper, especially for a headshot, because you're going to get lines in the skin or that sort of thing. I have seen the Unryu used say for a wedding or an engagement shoot where you have the couple out in a large field or out in nature somewhere where those fibers complement the environment and the subject is small enough that it doesn't interrupt or distract from their aesthetic. But yeah, I think you use the Japanese papers for their creative possibilities, not for their exact reproduction of the scene that you photographed.
The beauty of some of those Japanese papers, with all that fiber, you can backlight them and use that fiber to your advantage. I've done a number of prints of floral images and then added a backlight to them, and that texture coming through in the plant can be very, very interesting. It for me, it's all about am I trying to relate a exacting images, as you just said, Evan, or am I trying to relate a feeling? And that's what that paper, the choice of papers, is all about.
Agreed.
And Evan, someone is asking if you use pigment ink or dye ink for these examples that you're showing.
Yeah, so all of these were printed on pigment ink, mainly because the majority of the printers that I have are pigment ink. And to delve a little deeper into that, so pigment ink is considered sort of the king of archival because it is very tiny particles of the actual pigment color suspended in a solution to make the ink, whereas dye ink is colored liquid, right? It's a very fancy version of, say, the food coloring you have at home. So dye ink is going to look a little more vibrant often on glossy papers. It doesn't perform quite as well on matte papers because it spreads just a little more. It's what we call dot gain. So when that dot of ink hits the paper for pigment, it mostly stays put. For dye ink, it spreads just a little bit. But the real outcome is in longevity. So anytime you're selling prints, looking for things that are archival, that sort of thing, you always want to use pigment ink. And for most photo printers on the market, they use pigment ink. It's your sort of least expensive models from the main manufacturers that'll use dye ink. And then also most of your desktop all-in-one sort of 8.511 printers will use dye ink. Although we are seeing a pigment black often being added now, again, mainly actually for text, because it doesn't have that dot spread, that dot gain. So when pigment ink hits a piece of paper, it holds. So text looks sharper and that sort of thing. So you'll see these multifunction printers that are also sort of branded as photo printers, but it'll say, oh, they have a pigment black. Well, that's not necessarily for your photo. It's a benefit for your photo, but it's mainly for documents because the colors in those printers are typically always dye ink. You just see a pigment black. But yeah, these were all printed on pigment ink, and pigment ink is the archival standard.
What is the difference between satin and luster finish?
Almost nothing. Generally, luster will have slightly more, I'll call it texture, but it's not really texture, than satin, slightly more tooth. So here's the luster, and you can see it's got a kind of a pebbled finish. And so a satin is going to have a slightly smoother pebble to it. But typically for me, if you put a satin and a luster next to each other and I don't know what they are, I'm going to have a heck of a hard time telling them apart. And that just applies to, say, a paper that's just labeled a luster or a satin. We would say that the Juniper Baryta has a satin surface, but again, that's a Baryta paper on a cotton base. So it's a completely different conversation versus a photo luster or a photo satin to the Juniper. Again, we're sort of talking about two different things, but in terms of a traditional paper, a luster will have just a little more pebble than a satin.
So talking about printers, do Canon or Epson have better saturation? They're not looking for an endorsement, but they assume each manufacturer has an ink that may print better on certain Moab papers.
You would think so, but that's not really the case. Really, Canon and Epson are pretty much tied for saturation, or what we often call gamut, right? What's the total number of colors that can be reproduced on this piece of paper. They may vary just a little bit in maximum black density, but that depends on what paper, what media setting, what generation of ink, all that sort of thing. So mainly with a printer, you're going to select it based on, do you need roll paper? Do you print a lot of fine art sheets so that media loading needs to be robust? Do you have enough space for it? All that sort of thing. But no, you're not gonna get a noticeably better print between the two. They're very close to tied these days.
I have an Epson P800 here, and I have a Canon, the Canon 2100 to do larger rolls. And really, they're almost identical, if not identical, as far as the output goes. It all really comes down to how well my computer is kicking out zeros and ones to make sure that everything talks to each other properly. It's not about the printer in some ways. It's just how each one handles another. The Canon is set up for sheets, or not for sheets, but for rolls, where the P800 is set up for sheets. It's just easier for me that way.
Yeah, it's all about the tools, like different saw blades or different saws or anything else like that.
Yeah.
It's a tool to achieve a means.
Well, and that's what the paper is really, is it's part of your tool. It's just, I'm going to use a different type of canvas today to render what I want my viewer to see. We talk about a term in printing called rendering intent. Well, but the artist, the photographer, has a rendering intent, and that's what helps you really choose the paper that you're going to use. Is what is your rendering intent? And then you move on from there. It's not just a little button that you hit when you are about to output the image onto your sheet. It's more than that.
And if you want to know more about rendering intent and gamut and everything else, take a look at our webinar on soft proofing, where we spend a lot of time explaining that and how to be aware of it, factor it into it, use it to your advantage when you're printing.
What is the best type of file to print from? JPEG, TIFF, Photoshop?
So your gold standard is going to be a 16-bit TIFF. And to get there, you need to have started with a RAW file. And you need to make sure that when you're editing that RAW file, if you're in Photoshop or something like that, that you're editing it either in Adobe RGB or ProPhoto RGB. You can pick between the two of those. But we say a 16-bit TIFF for a couple of reasons. Number one, a JPEG is compressed every time you save it. What that means is when you save and close a JPEG, say you have in this image, let me grab another one. Let's see, here we go. Here's a good example. So in this image, we've got a lot of blue. So if I save and close this as a JPEG, the JPEG looks at the sky and says, well, it's all about the same color. And it throws away the data and leaves a little math behind that says, okay, make this blue when you reopen the image. Well, then if I open this image next week, it recreates this sky. And every time it does that, you lose quality, it degrades. With a TIFF, there's no compression and there's no loss of data. So every time you save a TIFF and then reopen it, it's exactly the way you had it at the beginning. The other question is 8-bit versus 16-bit. And we talk about this because 8-bit files gives you 256 shades between black and white. A 16-bit file gives you the potential of 63,000 shades between black and white. So again, in your gradients, in your water, in your skin tones, there's a lot more potential data in there, quality, smoothness that you can get in the file. So for printing, 16-bit TIFF. And if you're working in Lightroom, the whole time you're editing your file, it's not actually committing any of those edits to the pixels. It's making a recipe and you're seeing your raw file through that recipe. It's when you export the file out of Lightroom that it commits it. So you need to go in and change your Lightroom export preferences to TIFF, 16-bit, Adobe RGB. Lightroom defaults to, I think, a 8-bit sRGB JPEG, which is sort of the lowest common denominator, smallest gamut, most compressed file. So make sure you go in and change that so that if you're exporting and sending to somebody or exporting and sending it to a lab, you want it to be a 16-bit TIFF.
Evan, in Photoshop, it gives you a number of options when you save as a TIFF. Is there a particular recipe for those options that you prefer, and why?
So for me, if I'm working in Photoshop, I'm typically going to save a PSD, a Photoshop document.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's because it preserves all the layers and everything else.
Mm-hmm.
But if I'm going to send that file to someone, if they're going to open it identically to how I see it, we need to have the same or a very close match on our versions of Photoshop. And you need to make sure that if you have a filter installed that they don't have or something, that image is going to get kind of broken. So for me, if I'm going to send out an image, I'm going to keep my Photoshop file, but I'm going to do save a copy. I'm not going to preserve layers because wherever I'm sending it, they don't need layers. And I'm going to save it as uncompressed. So typically for me, my TIFFs are no layers, uncompressed. So again, it's the highest quality file, but wherever I send it, anywhere in the world, somebody's using Photoshop, version 5, they can still open that file and it's going to look identical to them as it does to me. But again, I can keep the Photoshop document for me, for my editing, because it has all the secret sauce and everything else. And, for those of you who have seen Jim edit in the past, it's got his 18 curved layers with all the magic that I haven't learned how to do yet, but it's all there and you can change it all later if you want. You haven't thrown away any data. You haven't committed any pixels that you can't go back and change as maybe your paper choice changes or your artistic vision changes, or you want to try a little bit of a grain filter on it, or you want to try a different form of sharpening or anything else like that. Or these days we have these phenomenal, AI sharpening tools. Maybe your image is a couple years old. You can go in and turn off the high pass and the define edges and everything else. And you want to run it through, Topaz or On One or something and see what their sharpening can do. Well, then you can just turn off those old sharpening layers and you're not dealing with a degraded file.
Yeah. There is at the bottom left side in the dialog box for saving your TIFF, it says something about, I think it's image pyramid or something along those lines. That I've always wondered about. I don't know anything about it. I tend to stay very simple and go, I don't want any compression, and I want to save it, for Mac and on, simply because I use a Mac. So I tend to keep my settings, but I don't know what I guess, 2 diagonal boxes in some of those little clicking options do for me. So, but I do.
I'm
that
of no help.
Okay. Well, I do know this, that editing in layers is really a gift, because you can always go back to square one. It's just like using a smart object, where you can always go back and redo things. And starting from ground zero can be a real interesting thing. I had to find some files for a client the other day and was going back to hard drives back to 2002, I want to say, and redoing some of those files in the see the save image pyramid.
Yep. No idea.
And then and then the other dialogue in that diagonal, that interleaved or per channel.
I've always seen as interleaved. I typically set my image compression to none.
Yep.
Byte order, I don't think matters anymore. And then obviously no layer compression because I've flattened the image to save it to the TIFF.
Okay. But being able to go back and re-edit in the current version of Photoshop or in Capture One, the files that I had edited back in 2002 have an entirely different look, and it's so much better. The noise structure, everything about it, the color, the whole 9 yards. It's like, oh, I can go back and re-edit everything and it'll look better. And this will be great. So
rediscover your old files. Yeah, the tools we have now are really amazing.
Much, much better.
The next question we have, do papers differ in their ability to handle fine gradations of color and luminosity?
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I would think so. Yes. I think that frankly our Beretta paper really can handle every little bit of color and luminosity that we can offer. And in fact, if you think of hue and saturation, those are actually luminosities. They're not just about color, as is lightness within that. So you're not just dealing with dark to light in terms of what a curve layer is, but you're dealing in luminosities of color. And so that Beretta is prepped in such a way, at least to me, that I can get every little bit out of that. Um, I also seem to have a lot of success with the Somerset Museum rag and the Entrada. So those, and well, and you're also going to get that same out of the Slick Rock. Now the Slick Rock Pearl will really make that evident.
And I think that this is a really good follow-up to the question about source file as well, because if you're looking for maximum detail, maximum gamut, that's going to go back to a 16-bit TIFF. You're probably going to see, especially on a larger print, based on your subject matter, you're probably going to see a bigger difference between, an 8-bit JPEG and a 16-bit TIFF at size than you will necessarily between a couple of different papers, because the source that goes on that paper is the most important, and then you use the paper to kind of interpret the image.
You're giving your printer, whether it be you or a lab, a lot more information to work with. If you can send them a 16-bit TIFF, I mean, they have so much to work with. And if you send it to them at full resolution, in today's world, they can enlarge it, enlarge it, enlarge it. I'm always amazed at how big I can make a file, make a print. There was a print that you printed for me, Evan, a little while ago of a sunrise over a fishing weir. And I think you were able to print that 40 inches wide by, I think it turned out to be 75, 80 inches long.
Yeah.
And I look at these things and I'm like, I did that? Really? It amazes me. It really does amaze me.
But again, you sent me a 16-bit TIFF file, which
Yeah.
was huge. It was a couple hundred megabytes. But
Yeah.
these days, with the speed of the internet and the relative value of hard drives, we're not limited by the space that we're using anymore. I think the hardest thing is, don't shoot that camera at 30 frames a second unless you really need to, because that's what's gonna chew up all your drives.
Well, and going back to what you just said, we aren't limited anymore. When you look at the number of different papers that we have, we aren't limited anymore. When you look at all the different papers that Moab offers to solve that creative problem, you're not limited. You have a full world out there that if one doesn't, the other will.
Yeah.
And that's what makes the difference. You have so much ability uh, to create and go on beyond just, oh, all you're going to have is presentation matte. That's it. No, it doesn't work that way anymore. You can really expand. I think the one of the nicest compliments I ever had, and Evan, you've been in my home and seen that big room of mine that's essentially a gallery,
Jim's
and
Gallery.
yeah, the Museum of Jim. Um, I had a fairly well-known artist come in and start to look around, and he would stop at each one, and you could hear him saying under his breath, "These are photographs." And part of it was that I had chosen to use for those particular images, the Somerset Museum rag, and it made the image look a little less photographic. So it was conscious on my part, and it really amazed that particular painter. It's kind of cool.
And that goes back to, using that paper as a tool, number one,
Mhm.
but number two, don't be intimidated by all the choices that are out there, because you don't need to know all 12 papers in the Moab line intimately. You're going to get your sample box, you're going to make your prints, you're going to look at, I love these two, or I love these three. The other ones, just set them aside, and they'll have a time and a place, but focus on what really appeals to your eye at that point, and then work from that as a base. Don't feel like you have to know everything all at once and be a master of these, because I've worked with the Moab papers for more than 15 years, and I feel pretty confident about them, but there are still things that surprise me, or subtleties or whatever else, based on the images I'm doing. Even to this day, I wouldn't say I, by any stretch, that I know all there is there to know.
What kind of image would you recommend for a test print?
Whatever you shoot. So if you shoot portraits, do a portrait. If you love landscapes, do a landscape. If you love, street photography, get one or two images of your street photography and use that. Because again, paper is such a personal connection, and it's the physical manifestation of the vision you had in your head. So you edit your image a certain, first of all, you frame it, right? You choose exposure, lens, depth of field, shutter speed, all those things to create the image. And then you edit it based on what's in your mind. What do you remember? Are you trying to reproduce it faithfully? Are you trying to kind of editorialize it? So the paper is sort of the third leg of that stool. How do you want the viewer to see the image? And so absolutely the best way, use the artwork that you're creating, because we've, this test image that you often see us use, again, this serves a very specific purpose. I'm going to use this when I'm looking at ink density, or how does a specific media setting on a printer handle gradients? How does a rendering intent, how to handle an out of gamut color? But this image, to me, if I, as a consumer, as a photographer testing papers, this image is going to tell me very little, because it has nothing to do with what I'm shooting and my style. It's a technical, it's like a gauge or a chart or a dial, right? But when you're looking at papers, you want to use your artwork, because it's expanding on that idea that you had in your head.
Yeah. And I can tell you that I make a test print often, almost every time, for each image that I'm going to print. A lot of times, if I only have 17 by 22 sheets, I'll cut them down to 8.5 by 11. And then I'll set it so that I print a smaller image off to one side. And so then I can move that each time and use the same sheet over and over and over again to look at what I'm doing. You can also, there are little tricks that you can do where you will create a curve layer on your image and then gradually fade that layer out, so that you can make a big move with the curve to increase your luminosity, and then fade it out, and then make your test print, so that you know exactly what you have to do and what you're going to get to meet the expectation that you have when you've done that output. But making a test print is incredibly important, and finding ways, frankly, to save paper and ink when you're doing that, so that you have it when you're going to do a larger print. The last thing you want to do is know you're going to go print a 24 by 36 print and just go straight to it. And all of a sudden you've just wasted a ton of ink and a ton of paper. And from a guy who's kind of frugal and that sort of thing, it's really important to do those test prints.
Yeah.
Which of our papers would you recommend using the Moab Desert Varnish?
So Desert Varnish is designed for matte black papers, not for the photo black papers. So for Moab, that means Anasazi canvas, Entrada bright natural and cold press, LaSalle photo matte, Somerset Museum rag.
Mm-hmm.
and also the Japanese papers, the Kozo and the Unryu. Yeah, but you don't want to use it on the pearl or the juniper or the luster because it will not be properly absorbed into the surface of the paper, and it'll bead up and look very strange. So Desert Varnish, matte black papers.
And this is kind of a two-part question about ICC profiles. So how often do you update printer profiles for each manufacturer and model? And do custom ICC profiles provide significant improvement over the ICC profiles from Moab?
First answer, we typically do not update profiles at all. So we spend a lot of time with the machine when it comes out, getting it really dialed in, post those profiles. Generally, they don't change. If there's some discovery down the line that maybe something isn't as we expected, then we might update a profile. There have been maybe one or two machines in the past where a new generation of profiling hardware came out right after the machine was launched, or even a little later on, and then I went back and updated. But those few profiles, we made a note that would say, all profiles updated on this date. But I think I've done that twice out of 30 or 40 printers. So typically, whatever you have downloaded from when you bought your printer, those profiles remain unchanged.
Well, the inksets aren't going to change. Your inksets aren't going to change at all.
Nope.
And so, there's not, but in all actuality, those Moab profiles that you are creating, they are custom profiles. You're literally creating them from the ground up. So it is a custom profile. It's as good as you're going to get.
Yeah, you will see the reason why you would go out and hire out a profile is if you notice that two things. Number one, for your specific setup, printers vary out of the manufacturing. I think 5%-ish is kind of average. The math, the chips, everything else, the print heads, they're not 100% identical. So there's a little bit of variation there. So if you have a paper that you're using and you notice that you've got everything else all set up, but it's just maybe off a little bit in the reds or in the blues or whatever else, then paying for a custom profile for that paper on your printer is going to fill in that last little bit of quality. But again, that's something that you're going to do farther down the line. It's absolutely not something that's required when you're starting out and you're just exploring color management and file prep and papers and all that sort of thing. But once you're maybe doing gallery prints or you're selling a lot of stuff and you're just looking for that extra little bit in quality, that's when I would say a custom profile probably makes a lot of sense.
And as always, calibrate your monitor. Calibrate. There is no exception for that. You have to. Otherwise, you don't have feet to stand on to begin with.
One of the few times we say you must.
So we have one question left. It might be geared more towards you, Jim, for your home gallery. Do you ever frame without glass?
Yes. You really have to be mindful of scratches, and that's where the Desert Varnish comes in. You have to be mindful of how you're going to mat. I would tend to use a frame that comes out beyond the surface of the print so that the print is recessed just a bit. And I had a dear friend who did a show up in Allentown at the museum in Allentown. He made huge prints, 40 by 60s and larger prints. And he had to replace a number of them because people would go up and touch and you'd get scratching and marring. And this was before Desert Varnish. So he had to replace a number, and he looked at those prints almost as throwaways because he knew that they were going to get dinged. So the glass, it helps, but you certainly can, and there's no reason that you shouldn't. You just have to be mindful of what's going to happen to the image. If nobody's going to touch it, if you're not going to have to dust it, if you know that you're not going to have to do a lot of things, sure. But that glass can protect, if you've got to clean the glass, okay, fine. You're not cleaning the print. The print's going to stay safe. and you're going to keep it away from marring. So,
And then that also, there's a big consideration of where you're going to hang that
yep,
print. So especially if you're going to sell a print that's not behind glass, you really don't want them hanging it in the kitchen, in the bathroom, in the light of a south-facing window, again, because it doesn't have that same layer of protection. And especially, if you're cooking or it's in a bathroom or whatever, there's all sorts of stuff that's atomized in the air that you want nothing to do with a fine art print. So if that's an aesthetic that you love, absolutely coat it in the Desert Varnish. If it's a photo black paper, which you can't use the varnish on, you may want to work with a frame shop and find a laminate, a plastic laminate that can go over that. They have a lot of options now that don't alter the look of the paper surface. But again, that's a physical barrier between the print and the rest of the world. So definitely, if you're selling that, make sure you're speaking with your customers about where they're going to put it, because you wouldn't want them to have the expectation that it's bulletproof, and then they call you up in 6 months or a year and say, this print is ruined. What are you going to do?
That's right. And I know this October, I'm going to have a show in Wilmington, Delaware at Blue Street Gallery. And I'm not going to frame prints. I'm going to hang sheets. So that scares me a bit. But at the same time, there's going to be a suggestion that you take the sheet and have it framed. And part of it is just the expense of framing. And I don't want to have to bear that. And the gallerist is all on board. She actually encouraged me to do it that way. So I think it's the right way to go for me and for this particular process.
And again, there are no, short of calibrate your screen and shoot in RAW, there are no hard answers here. So experiment, test it out, try different papers, try different framing methods. What works for you, what fits your vision. This is art, right? This is not, there is math and science in it, but it's aesthetic, it's emotional, it's your work. So don't be afraid to experiment and break things and try new papers and just have fun with it.
You look at, there's an artist, southern photographer named Jack Spencer. I'm not sure if he's still out shooting or not, but Jack would go so far as to put something called oleopasty, which was some sort of a varnish that oil painters used to use over his prints. It was just to get a different look. And it's phenomenal. So you can go play all you want, throw things on, do whatever you want, but it's having that great subsurface to start with, to output what you saw or what you thought you saw or what you felt onto that, and then move forward. And whether you frame it, whether you put stuff all over it, whatever you do, it's that beginning. And that's what we talk about with Moab is having that really premium thing to make your pictures sing, to make your pictures really pop.